Hi, it's Nero here from Investment Rise, and today we'll be covering the 10 commandments for investing in property in 2021. What thou shalt do and what thou shalt not do. So let's get into it. Property investing commandment number 1. Thou shalt not look at property without being clear on your investment strategy. I see this all the time. People who looking to buy property, they immediately start off with, well, where's the best place to buy? What's the right price to buy? What's the right property to buy? But if you're serious about investing in 2021, getting the kind of results that you really want, then you need to look at property last, right? So I don't want you to worry about what to buy. I don't want you to worry about, where to buy. I don't want you to worry about any of that stuff, which is, mind you, where most people start. I want you to instead begin with what's the right strategy for you. I mean, for example, maybe you are an extremely high income earner. You have lots and lots of disposable income each and every month. So for you, cash flow is not a concern, especially if you have a job that you feel is very, very secure. Well, in that case, you're going to focus on high growth properties. You'll be happy to look at negatively geared properties or negatively cash flowed properties, because you're just going to be focusing on growth maybe for the next 10 years. And then after that, you might then look at changing the strategy to be more positively cash flowed. Right? But then you might be in a situation rather where you have an existing mortgage, you want to buy property that yes is going to grow in value, but where it's not going to hurt the family budget, it's not going to affect your monthly cash flow, and if anything, it's going to help you pay off your mortgage more quickly. I mean, right now some of our clients are buying properties and have strategies in place that will help them pay off their personal mortgage in 10 years or less. Right? So you want to make sure that you understand what's the right strategy for you. Or maybe you're someone who is a little bit older, you have got lots of equity from your home or maybe one investment property, and now you're looking to transition into retirement. So you really want to be focusing on returns, you want to focus on solid cash flow, right? Well then, depending on which of those three situations you're in, and your situation again may be completely different. Remember, I don't know your situation, so this is not advice at all. This is just general. But regardless of what your situation is, you need to begin by getting clear on what that situation is and then working out what the right strategy is for you. What are your goals? What are your time frames? What are your constraints? For example, is time an issue for you? Or, are you unable to maybe do all the research? Or do you not like negotiating? Or what is it that's a bit of a constraint for you? Because once you get clear on all those things, you know what becomes really, really easy? What becomes easy is the fact that you can easily identify suburbs that you don't even want to look at. It becomes a very, very easy way to cull all the suburbs that you might be targeting, or all the areas that you're targeting, and get clear on the few areas that are going to be right for you. Then, property investing commandment number 2. Thou shalt not invest in property without knowing the vacancy factor of the area first. Now, let me ask you this. When you buy an investment property, what's the biggest risk? Now, if you're like most people, I know your answer is going to be getting a tenant, getting the property rented, right? And yet, I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to who are either in the process of buying an investment property or who already have an investment property, and yet they have no idea what the vacancy factor is on that area that they selected, okay? And mind you, it's not their fault, because I see a lot of people getting almost distracted by certain things. So people who are promoting these properties, shall we say, they focus on how nice the view might be. They focus on so-called infrastructure coming in, and they almost entice people to buy property without doing their proper due diligence, right? I mean, one of the biggest things is buy now or you'll miss out. And so people make all these investing decisions without considering the biggest factor of all, which is your vacancy factor. Right? And I don't want you to do that in 2021 because there is no doubt that even in the same city, there are some areas that have got really tight vacancy factors, but there are others that have horrible vacancy factors and where it's really, really hard to get a tenant. And if you're not doing your due diligence, you could come completely unstuck because it doesn't matter what the story is about the suburb or what you think the capital growth potential might be. If you can't get your property rented, everything will go pear-shaped. And the ones who do their due diligence, the ones who understand what the vacancy factor is, well, they're the ones who are going to invest in a safer and ultimately more successful manner. Property investing commandment number 3. Thou shalt not invest in property without knowing the cash flow returns first. I see this all the time where people say, I want to invest in property with a good rental return. The question is, what on earth is a good rental return? Right? Like what's good in Melbourne, for example, is horrible up in Brisbane. Okay? So rather than focusing on the rental return, you want to focus on, well, what's the cash flow? Right? Because ultimately it's cash flow that you're after. Either you need to know if you're going for a negatively geared property, because as I said earlier on, you may be someone who's got plenty of disposable income. Well, you need to know how negative it is every month. But if you want to look at something that's neutral or even positively cash flowed, well, you need to know that. I mean, I was recently speaking to someone who said, oh, look, Nero, we found this great property. It's priced at $600,000. We think we can get it for $580,000, and it'll give us a really good rental return. There's a tenant already in the property, and they've got another 6 months left on their lease, and they're really excited. And they kept talking about the property. And after I finished listening to them, I said, what's the cash flow on this particular property? Like, how positive is it or negative is it? And they just looked at me in complete silence. They had no idea. I mean, they were convinced that because someone had told them that this particular property where they thought they'd get it for $580,000 and they were going to get $400 a week in rent, well, that was a good rental return, right? But when we simply used some of our proprietary cash flow tools and we worked out the property was negatively cash flowed by $3,000 a year. Right? Now, of course, there are some negative gearing benefits that come with that. But the thing is, these guys were after property that was either neutral or positively cash flowed. But because they hadn't done their numbers, they were this close to making a horrible, horrible mistake. Okay, so you need to stop worrying about what the rental yield might be, or people say this is a good rental return, especially real estate agents. And I think real estate agents, many of them are really, really good, but a lot of them are really focused on helping owner occupiers. They don't understand how to help investors, so they just simply say, well, this is a really, really good rental return. But unless you've done your numbers, unless you've actually done your cash flow returns, you don't know. So do not buy an investment property this year without knowing what the cash flow will be. Commandment number 4 for property investing in 2021. Thou shalt not buy off-the-plan units in 2021. Now, if you've been following any of my work, you'll know that I have never been a fan of off-the-plan units, and I've often spoken about the dangers of them. But in 2021, I think those dangers are only heightened. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of people right now saying, oh, look, I'm buying this property. It's, I put in my 10% deposit. I don't have to worry about finance. The person who sold it to me said, I don't have to worry about it for 18 months or 2 years or whatever the time frame happens to be. And I immediately get shivers. Because the question is, you don't know what the bank will do in 18 months' time. Yes, everyone's talking about lending regulations being eased in March, April, which is going to be very exciting and really going to propel the market forwards. Absolutely. But you also don't know what the banks will do in 18 months' time. And if you can just cast your mind back to 2017, 2018, until sort of mid-2019, when banks really tightened their lending restrictions, and a lot of people who bought off-the-plan units got burnt. Why? Because they settled on a particular contract price. So let's just say they bought a unit for $800,000. Okay, they put in their 10% deposit, which is $80,000. But then when it came time to settle, the bank, for whatever reason, and remember the bank is judge and jury in this, you can't always argue with them. They turned around and said that they only thought that $800,000 unit was now worth $700,000. Which means you need to come up with a $100,000 difference because you've already signed a contract. And remember, these contracts are prepared by developers and developers' solicitors. And so you're locked into the contract. You've put in your 10% deposit of the purchase price. So that was 10% of $800,000 is $80,000. You've put in $80,000, given it to the developer. And that's not negotiable, or rather not refundable. Which means if you can't come up with the extra money the bank won't give you, which you thought they would, and they had agreed to in principle at the time you might have done your initial due diligence when you bought the property, guess what? You lose $80,000. And I've literally spoken to some brokers in early 2021, in January of this year, who said they are now refusing to write a loan for anyone who wants to buy an off-the-plan unit that's settling in the second half of 2022. So 18 months time or so, right? Because it's too risky. So you've got to be so careful that you will, and you really need to make sure that you do not buy an off-the-plan unit. The second reason why they're so dangerous as an investor is that it's not as if one unit comes onto the market at a time. Right? When you buy an off-the-plan unit, you're generally buying them in a high-rise tower, and so once the tower is complete, all the units come online, which means all the, naive investors who have bought these things, they're all now competing for the same tenants that you are, which means that invariably getting a tenant is going to be more difficult. Okay, so for those reasons, for the risk of losing money, for the risk of struggling to get a tenant, plus other reasons as well, thou shalt not buy an off-the-plan unit in 2021. Property investing commandment number 5. Thou shalt not buy investment property in small country towns. Now, this might seem a little controversial because right now there is a big push for large regional centers and investing in regional centers. But listen to my words, investing in large regional centers. All right. So areas, for example, like Newcastle, north of Sydney, the Central Coast north of Sydney, Sunshine Coast north of Brisbane. These areas. I'm not saying you're going to invest in them necessarily, but they do make sense to look at. All right, if the numbers work well. Why? Because these large regional areas have good infrastructure. They've got access to the capital city. So they're an hour and a half, 2 hours drive away. So they do make sense on some level. However, I'm seeing people going and buying in a small country town 6 hours away from Sydney or Brisbane because it's possibly cash flow and everything else. But the thing you're going to ask yourself is, well, where's the capital growth going to come from? Like, what's the infrastructure in the area, right? And there are many economists who expect that a lot of these smaller regional towns will have a reverse migration. So right now, they're at record high, prices are at record highs, people are investing, people are chasing the almighty dollar, I get that. But in 12 months' time, 24 months' time, when people who are living there go, well, we don't have the facilities here that some of the larger regional areas have or some of the capital cities have, you're almost certainly going to see people leave. Okay, and we've seen this happen before. Cast your mind back to what happened in 2010, 2011, 2012 with mining towns. They were all the rage. People were moving there. But then what happened? When the mining boom ended, when there was nothing else left to sustain these towns, people left in droves. Property prices dropped, and there are still some people who bought property back in 2010, 2011, 2012 in these mining towns, especially in Western Australia. And those properties today in 2021 are worth less than half what they paid for it. Now, I'm not suggesting that some of these regional towns are going to have that kind of drop, but I am suggesting that you're not going to see the capital growth long term that some people are talking about because they just don't have the necessary infrastructure. You've got to ask yourself when you're buying in an area, and if everyone says, oh, this is a great hotspot, you've got to ask yourself, what's going to drive the capital growth? And if you can't answer that question for yourself in a manner that you're happy with, you really need to put the brakes on and reconsider. Property investing commandment number 6. Thou shalt not buy a high-rise unit as an investment property in 2021. Look, if there is one segment of the market that has struggled as a result of the COVID pandemic, no doubt it's been the high-rise unit market. Right? Tenants have moved out in droves, meaning that the remaining tenants, it's become a tenants market for them. They can negotiate rents downwards. We've seen people in the inner west of Sydney have to drop their rent by 30% to try and get a tenant. Others drop by 50%. People in Melbourne, areas like Docklands, drop by even more than that and still struggling to get a tenant. And the thing is, I don't see that changing anytime soon in 2021. Why? Because a lot of the savvier investors, again, can see that the cash flow returns on units just isn't there anymore. They don't have the security of a tenant. It's actually a very high risk proposition. I mean, why would you buy an investment property where tenants get to determine the rent, the length of the lease, any terms and conditions? You're not in control. Plus, with the fact that the government is still giving out lots of incentives, with interest rates being at record lows, we're seeing lots of people who now move out of the unit market and buy houses. For example, I was speaking to someone just recently who was renting in Chatswood in Sydney. And if you know anything about the Chatswood rental market at the moment, rents on, say, your 2-bedroom units are roughly back to where they were 10 years ago. That's how much they've dropped. And yet this particular couple had now moved to the outskirts of Sydney. Why? Because with all the incentives and the first home buyer benefits, etc., they were able to get a brand new home and a house on the outskirts of Sydney, and they were happy to have that extra space, especially because they didn't have to go into work every day anymore. Right? And I'm seeing that more and more. And so I think you're going to see the returns on those high-rise units really struggle. I think you're going to struggle to see that capital growth because of the oversupply at the moment. Yes, a lot of homeowners are going into to buy units because that's what they want to live in by choice, which is awesome. But they're getting steep discounts on a lot of these properties. So that's not the kind of thing you want to be buying as an investor. You want to lower your risk. You want to stay safe as possible. And the expression is safe as houses for a reason. It's never been safe as apartments or safe as units, right? It's safe as houses. So in 2021, stay away from the high-rise unit market. If you really want to look at a unit, then stick to something that's low rise, so maybe a boutique apartment, areas that perhaps the North Shore of Sydney, upper North Shore, in those low rise apartments, not the high rise ones, or even the Northern Beaches, for example, are a couple examples of units that are still doing well. But generally speaking, in 2021, stay away from those high rise unit market. Property investing commandment number 7. Thou shalt not follow the investing advice of Americans on the Australian market. Right? I mean, we have seen too many Americans who come to Australia and give advice on what to invest in or where to invest, and invariably they have been totally wrong. Okay, for example, we had one guy who came to Australia in around about the second half of 2020, if I remember correctly, and he said property prices were going to drop 50% in Australia, and that you should, literally take your money and run. Mind you, this same guy came here in 2016, then he came here earlier on 2012, and every time he came here, he kept saying property prices are going to fall. Now, you've got to be wary of following this kind of advice because it's based on American fundamentals, which are very, very different. Look, mind you, this guy was also saying that American property would fall in value after this COVID-19 pandemic that we're having, and yet prices right now in the US in many parts are on the rise. So he's not even getting the advice right on his own country, let alone here. But he's just one example. There are so many who are saying this. We've seen other guys, for example, one individual in particular who came out and said, You need to buy units. Don't buy houses, buy units, because units are what's going to give you cash flow. And he was interviewing some of Australia's top media, and I saw people saying, well, this guy said it, so I'm going to do that. And I was like, no, don't follow that advice. It's American advice. It's not right for the Australian market. Okay, so you've got to be careful of following this advice from perhaps well-meaning big guys from America, shall we say, who've got big reputations, but they're applying American fundamentals to the Australian property market, and it has never yet been correct, and I'm not sure it's ever going to be correct, because when you study the economic fundamentals of both countries, America versus Australia, when you study the banking system, when you study the rental legislation, the two countries are so different. You can't just say that what's happening in one country is going to happen in another. So you've got to be careful, and certainly in 2021, don't follow the advice, or property investing advice rather, of any so-called American expert. You're going to come unstuck. Okay guys, just 3 more to go. Property investing commandment number 8. Thou shalt not rely on unqualified property investing advice. Now, here's what I mean by that. I remember when I first started investing in property back now 18 years ago, 19 years ago actually, and I was meeting a number of real estate agents, and a lot of them would say, this is a great investment property, you should buy. And they would then talk about the area and everything else, and compare it to other properties and all that stuff that a lot of agents did. But I would often ask them, and especially after spending hours with them looking at different properties, so how many investment properties do you have? The number of agents said, no, none. One in fact said, no, we don't buy real estate or we don't buy property in this particular suburb because we know what could go wrong. But the next breath he said, but that property that we showed you is a good deal. How would he know? Right? So you've got to be careful about what advice you're taking. The other type of advice, so-called advice rather, you need to be wary of is biased advice. And what I mean by that is this. There are many people in the property investing industry who are claiming to be so-called advisors and to be able to give you unbiased advice. But really what they're trying to do is direct you towards buying a property that they're getting some kind of kickback from, okay? Now, the problem is with many of these guys is that they only have access to a certain limited stock in limited areas, or they work for certain developers, builders, whatever the case happens to be. So if someone is trying to direct you and has a agenda and trying to then direct you towards buying property in a certain area, how can it be unbiased? I mean, I've had so many clients, one client in particular who said, Nero, I've got someone, let's call him John Smith, telling me that I should buy these units, or one of these units in Melbourne. He says these are the places to invest in. He's giving me these great brochures. They look really, really good. I said, awesome. And he said he claims to be independent. I said, awesome. Well, in that case, ask him to show you something in Brisbane as well. Ask him to show you something in Sydney as well, so that you can compare and make an informed decision. So my client went back and was stunned to see that John Smith all of a sudden said, oh, we don't have anything there. But no, you shouldn't invest there. This is the only area that you should invest in, because ultimately it was the only property he had. He was ultimately working for one particular developer. Okay, so you need to be careful about what advice you're getting. Ask yourself, is it qualified? And not just because someone's got a piece of paper. Look, that's not that difficult, unfortunately, okay, in Australia. What you want to ask is, are they investors? Have they invested for a number of years? How long have they been investing? Have they made their own mistakes? Right? Because if you are relying on someone who has never made a mistake before, who's done it 100% correct, you've got to ask yourself, are they just lucky? Right? Because I can tell you, as someone who's now been investing, I said, for 19 years, I have made my mistakes. Right? And that's why when I help people invest in property and they're going down a certain path, I can just stop and say, look, you don't want to go down this path because I know how it ends. I've been there and it hurts. It's going to cost you money and time. All right. And so one of my great value adds and our team's value adds to clients is that we can share our own war stories. We can share our own scars. We can share our own bad experiences. Okay, because we've made mistakes, that's how we've learned. So you've got to ask yourself, are these people actually experienced and qualified based on experience rather than paper, on just having a piece of paper? And secondly, are they unbiased? Are they just trying to get you into property that only they're licensed to access, or they only have access to for whatever reason? Yeah, that's not the kind of unbiased advice you want to be relying on. Property investment commandment number 9. Thou shalt not buy emotionally. Hey. This is a big one because it hurts people in so many ways, right? The number of people who I have seen go on holiday to a lovely, small, quiet beachside area, and they start to envisage themselves living there in the future. And they happen to just, they walk by and there's a real estate agent's office. And they literally come back from their 3-day, 4-day holiday having bought a property. I mean, what kind of research have they done? Literally zero. They bought purely on emotion. And then many of these guys are stunned to see, a year later that their property is vacant for several months a year. That some of them have tried Airbnb but found that doesn't always work as well as people said it would. Okay, so you've got to have a set criteria. This is the commandment number 1 that I spoke about. You've got to have a set criteria about what to buy, and it's got to meet your particular strategy. You don't just buy based on a hot tip from someone. You don't just buy because you like a particular area and made you feel good and you can envisage yourself living there in the future. These are not investments. An investment must stack up based on the numbers, okay, based on the data, nothing else. And then from an emotional perspective, the other thing I see so many people do is they buy something. They don't buy where they went to holiday. No, they buy close to where they live. Why? Because it's supposed to be safe. They can drive past the property and feel good about it. But let me ask you this. Does your ability to drive past a property help it grow in value? Right? If it did, then that'd be great. But that has never been a key capital growth criteria. All right. So you've got to take the emotion out of it, understand it's an investment, and then invest based on the numbers, based on the data, and make the right investment choice for you, again, based on your strategy. And then number 10, the final property investing commandment for 2021. Thou shalt not try to do this on your own. Look, there are, I think, on last count, about 15,000 suburbs that you could potentially invest in all of Australia, right? How are you going to do all your research on your own, especially if you're working full time, maybe you've got a young family, or you've got other commitments outside of work, and when you're already stretched for time? How are you going to do all your research? How are you going to inspect all these properties? Right? It's so easy to get overwhelmed. That's why people do one of two things. Either they don't invest at all. Right? They say, this is too hard. I can't find someone to help me. And guess what? They end up missing out on some significant capital growth. And then look back going, God, I wish if only someone had told me. Or what happens on the other front is they only look at areas that are close to home, or they limit their potential. Okay, it's for example like someone in Perth. Now Perth is a bit of a hotspot at the moment, supposedly. I'll come back to that. But people have been telling me that the Perth market is going to be hot. It's going to grow from all the way back to from 2014. Now, properties, mind you, in 2021 are still only priced at about what they were in 2014. So much for it being a hotspot. However, imagine if you lived in Perth, and therefore you can only do your research and you decide to do it on your own, and you research only suburbs around where you lived, where you're comfortable with, and you bought maybe an investment property. You'd have your home in Perth, you'd have your investment property in Perth, and you're sitting around twiddling your thumbs going, gosh, right? When there are so many other opportunities, when areas like Sydney, Melbourne, many of the regional areas, Brisbane have grown in value significantly, and certainly significantly more than what Perth has. Okay, so you want to make sure that you are not investing emotionally. You are having a team of advisors around you. Whether you ever reach out to me or not, that's different. But you need to make sure you have a team that you trust, who can advise you, who can get on the ground and look at properties for you. Because unless you're able to do this full time, how can you actually research, negotiate, ensure you're buying in the right areas at the right time for the right price? It's almost impossible for the average investor. And that's why I want to say the 10th and final commandment for 2021 is thou shalt not try to invest in property by yourself. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video valuable and you're thinking you might like my help to help you find an investment property, then head on over to nerocall.com to discover our unique 5-step process that's helped my private client group purchase now well over $66.2 million worth of property. And then if you like what you see, you can book in for a half-hour phone consult with me personally. Either way, thanks again for watching.